apologies, everyone. We had a slight interruption there with the camera, but we'll go right back into picking up where we left off with Mr. Parker here. I was stating that perhaps the particular Congregational Church in Rhode Island that Evegenia Smetisko joined looked attractive to her because it was unlike average Congregational churches, and perhaps looked very enticing to her because of the particular ornate windows and the architecture of the building.
I did visit that congregation.
You said because of the locality of where she lived.
Right, so I think it was a perfect combination for her.
Plus to protect and conceal her identity under her particular circumstances.
True, because if she, and we do know that many Romanovs were afraid for their safety during the Cold War. Nobody would look for her in a Congregational church. There is a Greek Orthodox church in Newport, but of course the Greek Orthodox church is not the same as the Russian Orthodox church.
That's correct.
And she didn't speak Greek, that I know of, and it was very close to her, and very ornate. It's a beautiful, beautiful church.
And when you said that a lot of the Romanovs had to stay low or lie low, wasn't there one person who was actually executed, who had been part of the imperial family, the young nephew?
Oh, right. There were a number. Right, a number were executed, and I think from speaking to people who lived through that era, they were always looking over their shoulder. As one told me, you never knew when somebody was going to jump out of the bushes with a poison-tipped umbrella. And I have to say, she's not, and I think she is, Evegenia is Anastasia, she's not the first Romanov to live under an assumed name.
Sure.
I believe it was the sister-in-law of the Tsar got out of Russia, if I may just look here for a second. And the information I got this from was from Corinne Hall's To Free the Romanovs, Royal Kinship and Betrayal in Europe, 1917 to 1919. It should be available in the United States next month. I got this from Amazon in the UK. One of the best books I've read ever about the Romanovs. And Corinne, if you're listening to this or watching it on YouTube, thank you very, very much. This should be in every single library, along with my book, of course,
yes.
I would say. But I got so much out of your book, Corinne. Also substantiation that maybe everything is not yet settled. There is room for further discovery. But I did read in Corinne's book that the Tsar's sister-in-law, Natasha, who was a widow of his brother Grand Duke Michael, she escaped. And she escaped with another name that was not her name, just as Evegenia escaped, or Anastasia seems to have escaped with the name Evegenia Smetisko. The Tsar's sister-in-law escaped with identity papers of Frau Tanja Kleno, a German name. And she...
Interesting.
Yeah, and she disguised herself as a Sister of Mercy, as a nun. So, I mean, it's not the first time that people would have escaped using false identity, false papers, false data.
To protect themselves in a dangerous situation.
Yes.
Now, unlike Anna Anderson, who tried to do everything she could to prove she was Russian.
And that she was Anastasia, right.
Yes, whereas Evegenia, she feels her life is threatened and endangered, and despite perhaps being proud of her heritage and her background, did everything she could to protect that along with herself by having to utilize strategy to cover, including switching...
Hiding in plain sight.
Yes, hiding in plain sight.
sight.
And switching to or converting to another religion.
Yes,
Yes, hiding in plain sight.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that she actually converted, because as I read your book,
Yes.
the Anastasia Again records of the Romanovs, they worshipped in the places where they were held prisoner. And all Alexandra did was make up an altar with her icons, and everyone prayed wherever they were. They could pray outside, they could pray inside. It didn't matter. The church didn't have to be there. Just they were and their God. That was it.
Now, I was not raised...
Excellent point.
Good point, yeah. I was not raised Russian Orthodox. I was raised as a Lutheran in an old Lutheran tradition of Lutheran, with German roots way back to Martin Luther himself. Martin Luther actually planned the baptism, adult baptism, of my 11th great-grandmother, Christina Manda, who married Volkmar Froben in Ichteshausen in Thuringia. So my Protestant roots go right back to the first days of Protestantism. But remember, Alexandra had been raised Lutheran. She was a very, very devout and convinced Orthodox woman, but her roots were based in Lutheranism. And one thing that you learn in Protestantism, especially in Lutheranism, that in all places you can pray. You should go to church, you should partake of the sacraments, but that your prayer life should be continual wherever you find yourself, even in prison, even in the worst of situations. So I think it's unwarranted when people say, well, she's not Anastasia because she went to a congregational church. I say she was a very good Christian, whether she was in an Orthodox church or a congregational church, or she was in her bedroom praying. It's all the same faith at that level.
She was still devout.
She was still devout, and we know, because you've read the book,
Yes,
and Garrett, you also, that it was that basic Christian faith, which is supra-denominational, that got them through the toughest times. Even at the very end, where they had one of the last services and they all knelt on the ground as though they knew that the end was coming. Even in their death, they faced it with a kind of nobility, which is a spiritual nobility, not an inherited nobility.
And they were given what was the last rites for the Orthodox Church when they knelt down and they were praying? According to your book,
Yes.
They were given, it was something that was meant to know that they knew that they were going to their deaths.
Even though, and it's very interesting that to my understanding, they had asked for another kind of service of Jakub Jurowski, who then arranged for it to be the different kind, which was maybe a kind of psychological preparation. I'm going to let them know by not telling them that their time is limited, because they seem to have known in a very somber but sort of resigned way. Yes. So.
And well, as you know, he was very good at playing psychological warfare onto them.
Jakub Jurowski?
Yes.
Jakub.
And then their other prisoners, their other jailers were constantly doing that to them.
Constantly harassing them.
Yes.
And what Vicky is referring to in the memoirs section that Evegenia wrote as Anastasia, which I have incorporated into my book, polishing it up for syntax and vocabulary and punctuation and style, how Jurowski sat on the bed just a day or two before the murder with an American-made pistol. And Alexei was horrified. And the father, the Tsar, was also mortified that his son would be afraid. And it is reported that Alexei asked Jurowski, "Is it loaded?" And Jurowski said, "No, not now, but it will be." If that's true, and I do believe it's true, I believe that Evgenia is really Anastasia, is really recounting to us intimate, inside information about what happened in those last moments in the Ipatiev house, that it shows you the depravity, the anti-Christian, anti-goodness of any kind that was seminal to many of the Bolsheviks. Not only did they say that religion was the opiate of the people, of course, because they wanted Bolshevism, they wanted communism to be the opiate of the people. They wanted that to be the center of people's lives. So they had to denigrate that which they could not appropriate. And it just shows you the depths to which they would sink to psychologically torment a child by saying the pistol is not loaded, but it will be loaded. And I think we know intellectually that Bolshevism was in many ways depraved. But I think reading the memoirs section of this book will give you an even deeper sense of what they must have suffered.
Absolutely.
And how they suffered so nobly, so beautifully. Even though they were suffering, they kept their unity as a family
That's right.
together.
And they tried to incorporate the soldiers who kept them prisoner, they tried to reach out to them to show them their humanity, and it was just they kept getting stonewalled a lot of times, and the soldiers didn't want that. And that leads to the question my sister had wanted to know. When they were executed, and they were being shot at by the soldiers, and as we know that they wore their bodices, and inside they sewed in all their jewels, just in case they needed to escape, that some of the bullets were bouncing off of them, that some of the soldiers, at least maybe most of them, knelt down thinking that they were protected by God. Why did they still continue to do this? Why didn't they go against their orders? Why didn't they go against the person who was giving them those orders? Why did they continue? Why did they bayonet them and knife them? Why? Why couldn't they just stop?
Well, I think this is a question that can be debated ad infinitum around the world. Why, when people realize that they're doing something evil, they're in the process of doing something evil, whether it was Stalin's Russia, whether it was Hitler's Nazism, why don't they stop when they know what they're doing is wrong? Yes, I did read also that in other sources that some of them thought, oh, the hand of God is upon them, protecting them. But at the same time, I think I've read also that they were drunk. They were very, very drunk. Their eyesight was impaired because there was plaster dust coming out of the wall. Many of them were shooting over the shoulders of the person in front of them and the person in front of them, and may not have been aiming to kill, but just to comply, to shoot to comply,
Yes.
not necessarily to kill. Though I think most of them had it in their mind that they had to complete that task, they had to kill them all,
Yes.
in order to comply with Lenin's order.
Yes.
So why they didn't stop, I don't know. But you know, I do want to say one thing about the jewel-encrusted bodices and corsets. In the book, Evegenia Anastasia asks her rescuer, Alexander, when you found me, was I fully clothed? And he said, yes, you were fully clothed. And she gives an exact accounting for the jewels, the number of jewels, the type of jewels that she had sewn into specially created pockets in her undergarment. And she mentions that later on in the course of escape, that a package filled with cash and with jewels is handed over to one of the people in one of the safe houses along the way. And I know this is a little bit a divergence from what you asked, but this notion that there were people waiting along the way makes me think, I'm not saying it's true, but it makes me think that this was not necessarily so spontaneous, that there may have been a plan in place in the event that they wouldn't be saved, that if anybody were to survive, they could get them out, almost like the underground railway. Because she mentions that she sees an envelope filled with jewels, and it could have been the jewels that were in her own bodice, helping to pay her way out of communist Russia.
And that would actually help her claim, too, if she knew this. As Evegenia wrote, she knew this. Then where would this information come from? It would come from her.
Right, she knew exactly how many diamonds, how many rubies, how many emeralds had been sewn. She gives an accounting. I can't tell you right now, I don't remember, but I remember being fascinated when I read it. And if you purchase the book, you will be able to read that.
And you'll also be able to see the remarkable pictures, the 3D pictures that actually convinced me, because I had always had my doubts. But then when I started reading the book and I started looking at those pictures and noticing the similarities, that they matched, I was becoming very, very convinced.
The photos were the clincher for me, but I have to tell you, when I read the October 18th, 1963 Life magazine, if you'd like to show that again, yes. Victoria, where there's a photograph of Evegenia, aka Anastasia, with Cleve Baxter, Grover Cleve Baxter, who started the CIA polygraph unit. 15 hours into his 1963 session with Evegenia, he said to her, "Excuse me, but you are withholding information. You are telling me that you are a friend of Anastasia to whom she has entrusted this information. Something is wrong. I'm seeing it's not, there's some kind of dissonance going on. I want you to now recount, answer these questions as though you were Anastasia." She does that for another 15 hours and she passes. And Grover Cleveland says, Cleve Baxter rather, says she's telling the truth. She is Anastasia. And his techniques are still used at the CIA. There is a Baxter School of polygraphic lie detection. It's now been bought by another Canadian firm, I believe, but those techniques are still being used today.
So that's remarkable that you could do that for 15 hours.
Yeah, well, 30 actually. 15 as not Anastasia, 15 as Anastasia. I'm sure it was in various days. I don't think it was 30 hours.
Yes, but still, it shows that that 15 hours that she was claiming to be a friend showed that she was lying, that they spotted it.
They spotted the deception.
Exactly.
Yes. Interesting.
Sure thing. And it's really notable, as you mentioned in the past, John, how Ms. Smetisko left so much memorabilia that belonged to the Romanovs to the Holy Trinity Monastery.
Garrett, that is an interesting fact which you are talking about. May I expound on that a bit?
Of course.
It is my understanding, and if I had to sign one of those documents, I attest, this is to the best of my knowledge, that she acquired a number of those artifacts in the paradigm, in the context of the St. Nicholas House Foundation, which she was running as a non-for-profit in Newport, Rhode Island. But I also heard and I think my source is very reliable, that the adopted son, I can hear the birds now, if any of you can hear the birds, of Sidney Gibbs, the tutor, the adopted son, gave many of these Romanov relics, objets d'art, to Evegenia. Evegenia then gives them to the museum because she had always wanted, she talks about it in her memoirs, had always wanted to found a museum of Russian history and culture to maintain the historical connection to Tsarist Russia, so that her family would not be defamed, to not let communism, Bolshevism be the last notion that people had of what Russia was. And so it's interesting. And I cannot answer this question. Maybe some people in the audience have a better idea than I do, have a better clue. Why did Sidney Gibbs, the tutor, who took many Romanov objects out of Russia, even from the Ipatiev house, which he went to after the murder, collects what he can get his hands on and takes them out, takes them to England, to Great Britain.
That's right.
He becomes then a monk.
That's right.
He converts to Orthodoxy.
And he takes the name St. Nicholas.
St. Nicholas, right. And Evgenia forms the St. Nicholas House Foundation. And then his adopted son gives these objects to Evgenia. Now, why would you give priceless objects to an impostress?
Yes, or an eccentric. And
Eccentric impostress.
yes, and why would he then, why would the church take it from an eccentric opponent?
Well, that part I can understand because the object is the object and it's...
But it's still, they have to go through different channels. They can't just accept something like that.
Yeah.
It might be stolen goods.
Yeah. And yet she gave it to them, fair and square, and it's, you can see many of them in this beautiful, beautiful collection, which is a must-see, I think, for anybody in the world who reveres or is interested in that Tsarist epoch of Russian history, to go to the museum in Jordanville. It's top-notch. It was reviewed, I believe, in the New York Times article, 2015 maybe, by Eve Kahn. Treasures and Trivia of the Romanov, of the Tsars or something, but it's Eve Kahn is the author, and that article did appear in the New York Times, where Evgenia is thanked. She's acknowledged as being one of the contributors. And it does mention that she claimed to have been Anastasia, but it's not, nothing further is delved into in that article, but at least she's mentioned, and so Evgenia has appeared in the New York Times.
That's, you know, and then really,
Excellent.
it goes back to that Sidney Gibbs. Why would his son, his adopted son, give something to an imposter? It's exactly what you said.
And like John says,
Yes.
what poor Eastern European immigrant woman would have in her possession all of this memorabilia and regalia of the Romanov family? Plus she left a monetary sum to the churches, to the
It is my
Orthodox
understanding
churches.
that it is an annuity in perpetuity of various tens of thousands of dollars forever and the day, which will never expire. And that is being overseen by a Rhode Island foundation, where the money is in trust, I believe. We can contribute to that fund also. The contributions are accepted. But the money for that museum will be forthcoming forever and ever and ever, which seems very odd for an imposter to do.
And as we
Definitely.
talked, yes, as we talked, you did an itinerary of her comings and goings from England to America. That's fascinating. How would she have the money to do that?
Right, because on her immigration papers, it says that she comes as a milliner, a hat maker. Well, I don't know many hat makers, even at the height of the Belle Epoque, you know, the Golden Age. How could they have made that much money to be able to bequeath so much money forever and ever and ever? And it's interesting, Vicki, that you mentioned that. Using Ancestry.com, I have to give a shout out to Ancestry.com. I was able to come up with many of the ship manifests for the first time that she came, various trips that she had made to Great Britain, seeming to be there for Christmas and then seeming to return always for New Year's. Who was she visiting? In Great Britain. Of course, if she's Anastasia, we do know that the British royal family would be her relatives. The Romanovs were in Great Britain. Of course, nobody would ever put her in danger by publicly acknowledging her.
That's right.
What is interesting, though, is that various dates of birth are given as date of birth. 1899, that's the year that she was born, supposedly as Evegenia Smetisko. 1901, that's the age of when Anastasia was born. Even 1909 is given as another year of birth. Her nationality is given sometimes as Ukrainian, sometimes as German from Yugoslavia. One time she even states that her nationality is Ukrainian. So that was very
ambiguous.
Very ambiguous, and almost that she was covering up she was covering up what she was covering up, yes, to keep people from the real truth. Yes. Various levels of deception, but savvy deception, in order to protect her true identity.
Which she was more than likely allegedly returned to in the cemetery of Holy Trinity Monastery.
Great that you mentioned that. Would you like to give a little lead-in to what you're referring to?
Yes, please, John. Thank you. As we were discussing earlier on our way here this morning, which is now afternoon, but we were on our way here in the latter morning, I had stated to you, John, in our conversation earlier, about reflecting back on her having joined the Congregational Church in Rhode Island, and then you were reiterating about her, how the Russian Orthodox do not believe in embalming, but they made a special dispensation for Evegenia to be such because her body crossed state lines. But not only that, just the fact that I had asked you this morning, was Anastasia Romanov baptized Russian Orthodox as a little girl? And you said yes.
Absolutely. We know that from history, her godparents were...
Just concurring what history said. Mm-hmm. So my thoughts wandered to perhaps, besides the fact alone that her body crossed state lines, maybe there's the feeling that the Russian Orthodox Church felt that Evegenia did what she did to protect herself, and that she was returning back to, or say converting back to, what she always was to begin with. She, you know, like you're back home, Anastasia.
I think good evidence for that is seen on the cross of her grave. We know from her travel documents, from her immigration papers, that the woman known as Evegenia Smetisko came with a birthday of 1899. But when I finally found the grave, after many years of looking, nobody really wanted to show me where she was buried. They kept saying, oh, in the new section. Well, where's the new section? Oh, in the back. Okay. Can you take me? No, I don't have time. These are